Uh, Hello. I'm sorry, I'm running short on time. This is about my uh, fifth recording because I keep going over the time. It's hard because of that reflection kind of stretches out. So I'm just gonna just push straight through this because I'm running really low on time. I have to get to work. I'm a flight attendant, so I have to definitely leave soon. But my name's Rodney Madison. This is my video journal for the Stanford experiment film for Governor State University for the Ethics and Psychology course due on June 10th, 2021. I'm going to start with the reflection. I'm going to start with I'm just going to go right off of my notes because I don't have the time to really get too deep into it. And I have to meet my 10 to 15 minute time. So here we go. The Stanford prison experiment. It depicted a real life experiment. It showed scenarios of volunteers being uh, randomly selected to be guards and prisoners. Um, it made them lose control and question themselves throughout the experiment. Um, at one point throughout the experiment, the prisoners felt so uh, emotionally triggered that they planned to escape because the guards at a certain point began to abuse their authority. But given the permission of Zimbardo, which made me feel really uh, uneasy because I feel like Zimbardo, after a certain point, should have stepped in to say what is right and what is wrong, kind of as a higher authority to say if you do abuse your authority, you should be corrected to not do that any further. So that way you kind of have a standard of upholding the ethics or the integrity of the experiment uh, to the standards that it's supposed to be, and not try to meet these uh, torturous, sadistic like situations that kind of went throughout the film. I remember day one, 8612. Um, he was thrown into the hole, and that really made me feel some kind of way. I myself have never been in a hole or anything like that. But I remember I was out one time bar hopping, and I was uh, just kind of hanging out. The whole this part of the story, my other recordings kind of dragged on. So to make a long story short, I ended up at a hospital under my free will. I wasn't incoherent. I could actually walk, stand, do everything, but that was my option. Um, it was either that or spend the money in my wallet to go home, which I was kind of far, and I was trying to avoid doing that. I was making decisive move in that moment. But while in the hospital, even after I ended up sobering up, I ended up trying to leave, and one of the security guards just walking through ended up telling me that I wasn't able to leave, and he ended up calling people to help him drag me back into a room and handcuff me into a one of the beds in one of the rooms, and had a nurse put me out with a sedative. And I ended up eventually going to sleep. But right before I went to sleep, the officer, after he let everyone leave, started elbowing me in the face for no reason. Like at that point, I was handcuffed to a bed and I was given a sedative to go to sleep. So at that point, that he ended up elbowing me in the face, I felt that was way out of line. The other recordings, I went far too deep into this reflection. But even the next morning, when I woke up and I was able to leave and I was able to collect my belongings in a hospital, collecting my belongings in a hospital. Um, when I went to grab my wallet, my money that was in my wallet, that from the time that I was going to take the cab home, that would have cost too much, and the time that I was in the hospital, where the ambulance that just randomly drove by and was like, they saw a group of people who were just talking to me, helping me decide if I wanted to take a cab or just kind of hang out. And just because a group of people was there, ambulance ended up just randomly driving by and ended up bringing me to the hospital, which kind of was the reason I ended up in the hospital, just because they were like, well, at least you could stay in a warm place for the night until you sober up. And I was like, oh, good idea. It wasn't so good of an idea. But from that moment in time, from that brief interaction, the officer that was elbowing me in my head must have, when he took my belongings to the security checkout, took the money out of my wallet, because I know I had money in my wallet. He wanted to say, oh, that guy was drunk and he doesn't know what he's talking about. I knew what I was talking about. But anyway, ever since that moment, I don't trust any situation where a person in a uniform who wants to abuse their authorities. The second that I feel that they're doing that, camera comes out, I start recording, and I let the videos tell their own story. But while watching the movie, I started to feel for these people. Because I understood, like, there's no reason for, they're both volunteers, both students, uh, and as Zimbardo said in the film, the difference between them was simply a flip of a coin. It didn't have anything to do with their actual lives or history or nothing like that. One was a guard, one was a prisoner, not for the sake that one wanted to be a upholding citizen and one wanted to be a prisoner. It was simply just because they flipped a coin, and in that flip of a coin showed two different personalities that randomly came out. Um, but yeah, in most of my encounters, especially in that hospital encounter, I felt helpless, just like those prisoners there when they're being held against their will. And um, for them, luckily, they didn't have people to actually inject them with things that could put them out. I didn't know what the nurse was putting into me, but I wasn't even upset with her. I was more so upset at the officer who decided that it'd be a good idea that after I'm handcuffed to a bed, he could just start elbowing me in my face because he felt like I'm a security guard at a hospital and this is my job. It wasn't his job. Um, but I'll move on to the APA Ethics Code principles. The APA Ethics Code specifically outlined five general ethics principles in carrying out the research that involves human beings as the subject under the study. Zimbardo, in his experimental research, upheld some of these ethical principles while violating others. The first principle is beneficence and non maleficence, which obligates psychologists and researchers to protect the welfare and rights of the subjects involved. So in the movie, Zimbardo willingly violated the rights as he held biases and neglected to listen to the woes and cries of the prisoners like 8612 to suit his expectation and behavior observation of the prisoners. He violated the prison set standards to influence the prisoners' behavior according to his expectations. Um, the next APA principle is fidelity and responsibility. It advocated for the complete involvement of psychologists and researchers in the actual research process and ensured the conducive environment for people and subjects involved in that environment. So Zimbardo, he upheld the principle, and he was involved in making the observations and staying awake with his counterparts, observing recordings and the scenarios in the prison. Um, Besides, he also took whatever the prisoners were being fed and he stayed in the same place for 2 weeks, just like them, while carrying out the research. So, the next APA ethic code was respect for people's dignity and rights. And it advocated for the equality and promotion of unity amongst those involved in the experiment, despite their socioeconomic status and ethnic backgrounds. So Zimbardo's experiments, they involved participants from different backgrounds as either prisoners or correctional officers, and the prisoners were treated equally. However, Zimbardo did not respect their privacy when they were changing clothes to in the prison environment. So the fourth ethnic principle code is integrity, and it strives to eliminate deception and avoidance of distress amongst the subjects involved in this experiment. And so Zimbardo, he violated this principle when he was having the recorded psychological behaviors of the prisoners under the conditioned situations, and he tried to make them look natural, but they weren't realistic, and they were not simulated naturally. So prisoner 8612, his behavior um, and how he tried to have a sort of deception in his behavior after a certain point. The results of the experiment, it lacked legibility and truthfulness. So applying the findings and his psychological decisions regarding Zimbardo's experiment, it is held to controversy and it lacks credibility. So the fifth and final ethic code, I'm running short on time, so I'm trying to speed up, is justice. It's the justice principle, and that promotes fairness and impartiality amongst the subjects involved in the experiment. And participants who were prisoners in the experiment, they didn't have access to what they wanted. Their wants were ordinarily part of the everyday lives of some of them were drug users. And Zimbardo violated this principle by enforcing rules that hindered the rights of the prisoners. He induced psychological torture to the prisoners as well. So I'm going to move on to the informed consent article, because Zimbardo's informed consent article, it adequately conformed to the current ethical guidelines, and the article depicted the participants' understandings of the purpose of the research, the duration, the procedures that would follow, and it stated the conditions of if they wanted to withdraw, how they could do so. It addressed the issue of personal privacy and dignity through the experiment, and the Zimbardo consent article indicated benefits accruing from the experiment participation, such as the $15 or something like that. So all above the factors, they're all currently ethical conditions and are addressed in the article of consent with a witness during acceptance of the research experiment. So the reflection of standards of the 8.04 to 8.08, Zimbardo's study is ethical and compared to modern day standards. This is because the research has adequately followed the set. I'm looking at the time, sorry. The set ethical standards and validation from various and responsible research authorities. From standard 8.04 to 8.05, Zimbardo's research reflected all of the standards, and furthermore, the psychologist Zimbardo provided adequate rules to be followed when he wanted, when any of the participants wanted to withdraw. So similarly, the participants were allowed to benefit from the research through funding, but Zimbardo dispensed informed consent for the research, and therefore the article included all the necessary research ethical standards, making the study ethical. Besides, the participants were debriefed about their roles, and Zimbardo followed the correct procedures while interviewing participants that adequately qualify for the experiment. Thus, the study is ethical, and it included all the ethical procedures. Despite how I felt, it was all ethical. So Zimbardo's study credibility. Zimbardo's investigation of human behavior on violence, power, and subjugation justifies the means of his findings. Zimbardo induced behavior eliciting behaviors depicting how prisoners responded to the officers and their demands and their cruel behaviors. He also proved that under certain conditions and environmental settings, I'm running short on time, I got about 2 minutes, our immediate environment high influences behavior modification. The behavior of the prisoners changed under violence, subjugation, and power from the correctional officers. Thus, Zimbardo's experiment justifies the end means of the experiment. It depicted the influence of power on subjugation and violence, and thus human power can amend behavior while extraneous conditions elicit behavior. So the Ben Bloom argument argued strongly against Zimbardo's experiment. He points out that the following interviews of the participants involved in the experiment depicted the research process was conducted depending on Zimbardo's interests and expectations. Bloom argued that the experiment procedures followed were not credible and ethically construed. He argued that the research findings don't apply to any psychological study because they lack credibility and legibility. The findings were baseless and are not applicable in real life situations, and Bloom's arguments don't alter my understanding and psychological beliefs. I believe that Zimbardo's experiment is ethical and applicable in studying human behaviors, and it followed the guidelines and correct procedures for carrying out any research. And that is the end of my video journal number 1, and I just made that time. Trust me, this went for about almost an hour just off the reflection itself. This is the very short version, but thank you for listening to me. See you next time.